For years, Daystar seemed unshakable, a powerhouse of faith, family, and flawless image. But everything changed when Rebecca Lamb stepped forward with a confession no one saw coming. Her words didn't just stir whispers, they detonated a bomb inside the legacy Joni and Doug had spent decades building. What she revealed behind the cameras shocked even the closest insiders. And now, the truth is spreading fast. Nothing at Daystar will ever be the same again. For years, Rebecca Lamb carried a secret that quietly chipped away at her peace. On the outside, she smiled brightly for the cameras. She stood beside her family as one of the faces of a well-known Christian ministry, Daystar. People saw her as confident, faithful, and blessed. But behind that public image, Rebecca was struggling with something much heavier, something she couldn't talk about, even if she wanted to. And that's because of one thing, an NDA. The non-disclosure agreement she and her husband JW signed was supposed to protect the ministry's reputation. That's what they were told. In truth, it became a legal muzzle. It didn't just cover finances or business details. It went far deeper, touching on personal issues that should have never been hidden. Rebecca had seen things that troubled her deeply, things that made her lose sleep. She had questions that no one wanted to answer and concerns that no one wanted to hear. But the NDA was clear: say nothing or face the consequences. There was one thing that haunted her more than anything else: the safety of baby Lamb. A child in the family. There were moments that didn't feel right, words spoken behind closed doors, and behaviors she couldn't ignore. She worried constantly, but every time she thought about speaking up, the fear of legal threats, family backlash, and public humiliation stopped her cold. Rebecca had grown up in a world where loyalty meant silence. Protecting the family name was the top priority. Her father, Marcuslamb, had built something powerful, and any crack in that image felt like betrayal. So, she stayed quiet. She showed up to events, smiled for pictures, and kept the truth locked deep inside. But silence started to feel like complicity. Every day she kept her mouth shut. She wondered if she was helping cover up something that needed to be exposed. The guilt was heavy. She prayed for guidance, asking God for clarity, for courage, for a way forward. But the answers didn't come, just more silence. She felt stuck, trapped between doing what was legally expected and what she believed was morally right. Even with JW by her side, the weight of it was hers alone. He supported her, but he couldn't carry the emotional burden for her. She often found herself lying awake at night, replaying moments in her mind, wondering if staying quiet made her just as guilty as those who had done wrong. Still, she said nothing, because speaking out meant blowing up everything: her family, her reputation, the ministry, and her entire world. And for a long time, the fear of that explosion was enough to keep her locked in silence. But deep inside, the pressure was building, and she knew one day it would have to come out. Grief has a way of changing people. It can pull families together or slowly tear them apart. For the Lamb family, the loss of Marcus Lamb in 2021 wasn't just the death of a husband and father. It was the collapse of the foundation that held them all together. Rebecca, Joni, and the rest of the family tried to carry on. They said all the right things in public. They leaned on scripture. They clung to faith. But behind the scenes, everything was shifting, and that shift started slowly. Then all at once, Rebecca had always looked up to her father. He wasn't just a preacher, he was the heartbeat of Daystar, the calm in the storm, the one who kept peace when tensions ran high. His death left a hole no one could fill. At first, the family tried to stay strong. Johnny stepped into leadership with determination, wanting to keep the ministry alive in Marcus's honor. But grief doesn't wait for convenience. It creeps in through late nights and silent mornings. And the more Joni leaned into her work, the more distance began to form between her and Rebecca. Then came Dougweiss. At first, it seemed innocent. Doug was an old friend of the family, a Christian counselor who had spent years helping couples heal. He had credibility, charm, and a deep knowledge of Scripture. When Joni started leaning on him for emotional support, no one thought twice. She was grieving. She needed someone. And Doug seemed to be exactly that. Someone solid, someone safe. But the friendship quickly turned into something more. What began as quiet dinners and prayer meetings evolved into public appearances and shared interviews. Joni and Doug didn't try to hide it. In fact, they seemed proud of it, smiling for cameras, posting on social media, talking about second chances at love. And while the outside world praised Joni for finding happiness again, Rebecca felt her heart sink. To her, it was too soon, too sudden. Her father had only been gone a matter of months before his memory seemed to be fading into the background. Joni wasn't just moving on, she was stepping into the spotlight with someone new. Rebecca didn't know how to process it. She wanted to be happy for her mother. She wanted to believe this was about healing, not replacing. But deep down, it felt like something sacred was being brushed aside. She tried to talk to Joni, quietly, gently, without judgment. But Joni didn't want to hear it. Their conversations turned cold. Joni insisted she had the right to move forward. She said Rebecca was being critical, not supportive. What was meant to be a daughter reaching out in love became a wall between them. As Doug became more involved in Joni's life, he also began to influence decisions within the ministry. Rebecca started to notice changes, small at first, but impossible to ignore. Leadership meetings she used to be included in were suddenly happening without her. Big decisions about Daystar's direction were being made, but Rebecca wasn't being asked for input. It didn't feel like a family-run network anymore. It felt like something else, something controlled. The more Doug's presence grew, the more Rebecca felt like she was being quietly pushed out. Not officially, no one ever said it directly, but the message was clear. Her voice didn't carry the same weight anymore, and the people who once stood beside her now hesitated, afraid of picking the wrong side. It hurt, not just because she was being excluded, but because she felt like she was losing her family in real time. The tight bond she once had with her mother was unraveling. The shared purpose they had built together now felt like a performance. And the more Rebecca tried to hold on, the more isolated she became. Family dinners turned tense. Smiles became forced. The grief they should have processed together was now something they were experiencing in separate rooms, with separate truths. Rebecca wasn't angry at her mother for falling in love again. She understood that grief takes people in different directions, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, not just with the relationship, but with the way it was changing everything. She worried that Doug wasn't just a partner, but a gatekeeper, someone who was steering her mother, the ministry, and the legacy of Marcuslamb down a different path. And every time she tried to speak up, she was met with resistance. Joni would accuse her of being divisive. Doug would stay quiet, but always seemed to be in the room when hard conversations happened. There were moments when Rebecca felt like she didn't recognize her own family anymore. She'd walk through the halls of Daystar and feel like a stranger in the building she had grown up in. People looked at her differently now, some with pity, others with suspicion. She could feel the divide, and it wasn't just personal. It was spiritual, moral, fundamental. She thought about her father often during those months. What would Marcus have said? Would he have approved? Would he have protected her? Those questions haunted her. And with each passing day, the gap between her and her mother grew wider. Words were exchanged, feelings were hurt, trust was broken. Rebecca didn't want to make this public. She never wanted a family matter to become a headline, but she also didn't know how to keep pretending. Her silence was tearing her apart. And the deeper Doug became involved in their lives, the more certain she became that things would never go back to how they were. The grief that was supposed to bring them together had instead exposed all the cracks. And what was once a united family of faith now stood on opposite sides of a painful divide, one built not just on loss, but on silence, control, and a love story that left too many questions behind. Rebecca knew something had to change. But what that change would cost, she was only beginning to understand. For years, Rebecca Lamb lived under a cloud of silence. It wasn't just emotional, it was legal. The NDA she and her husband JW had signed wrapped around their lives like a chain, one they couldn't break without risking everything. Every time she wanted to speak up about what was really happening behind the scenes of the Daystar empire, that document stopped her cold. It wasn't just a few pages of legal language. It was fear, written down in ink. Rebecca had spent countless nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if she'd ever be free to speak the truth. Her silence didn't feel like protection anymore. It felt like prison. And no matter how deeply she prayed, no matter how badly she wanted to act, she stayed frozen. Not because she didn't have something to say, but because saying it could destroy her family, her future, and the very ministry her parents had built. But then, something unexpected happened. It started with a news story, one that at first had nothing to do with her. In early 2024, Texas lawmakers passed a new bill called Trey's Law, named after a young boy who had been silenced through a non-disclosure agreement after suffering abuse. The law changed everything. It said very clearly that NDAs could no longer be used to cover up or suppress information related to child abuse. No matter what had been signed, no matter what legal threats were hanging over someone's head, they now had the right to speak. Rebecca read the story once, then again, and again. Her hands shook, her heart pounded. She had spent so long thinking the law was against her that the contract she had signed meant she had no choice but to stay quiet. But this was different. This was freedom. It didn't erase the fear, but for the first time it gave her hope. The chains that had kept her silent didn't feel as heavy anymore. She called JW into the room and handed him her phone. "Read this," she said. He didn't need to ask what it meant. He understood immediately. They sat in silence for a long time after that, staring at the screen, both overwhelmed by what this law meant for them, for the truth they'd been holding for years. Trey's Law gave Rebecca more than just legal permission. It gave her permission to listen to her heart without fear of punishment. For so long, she had thought silence was the only way to protect the people she loved. But now she realized protecting them had also meant ignoring her own voice and ignoring the warning signs she'd seen along the way. The most painful part wasn't just what she knew. It was knowing that a child, baby lamb, might not have been fully protected and that her silence had played a part in that. She carried that guilt every day, and now she finally had the chance to do something about it. But the decision to speak wasn't simple. Just because the law had changed didn't mean the cost had. Rebecca knew that breaking her silence would set off a storm. She would lose relationships. She would be called names. People would say she was betraying her family, attacking the church, or just seeking attention. But even with all of that, the voice in her heart was louder than ever. It's time. She and JW spent the next few weeks in deep prayer. They talked late into the night. They opened old files, reread letters, pieced together everything they'd experienced. They wanted to be sure, truly sure, that this was the moment to step forward. Every time doubt crept in, Rebecca thought of Trey. She thought of the boy the law was named after. She thought of baby lamb, and she thought of all the others who had been silenced. She wasn't just doing this for herself. She was doing it for every person who had been told to stay quiet for the sake of appearances, for every woman who signed a paper thinking it was the only way to survive, for every child who didn't have a voice of their own. When Rebecca finally spoke, it wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It wasn't a headline-grabbing explosion. It was calm. It was honest. It was heartbreaking. She released a statement, not to the tabloids or the talk shows, but through her own words. No spin, no drama. Just the truth. She shared how the NDA had kept her silent, not just legally, but emotionally and spiritually. She shared the inner conflict of trying to stay loyal to her family while also carrying the weight of serious concerns. And she shared, with tears in her eyes, why she had finally decided that silence was no longer an option. Her message spread quickly. At first, it was whispers, quiet conversations behind closed doors. Then it was blog posts, social media comments, and videos. People began reaching out, survivors of similar experiences, former employees, viewers who had always felt something wasn't quite right. Her courage opened a door that many had kept closed for years. Of course, the backlash came too. Some people couldn't handle the idea that the perfect family they'd watched for years on TV might be flawed. They called her ungrateful, a liar, a homewrecker. Some accused her of using faith as a weapon. But Rebecca held firm, not because she was fearless, but because the truth meant more than her reputation. Meanwhile, the law that had set her free, Trey's Law, began to ripple through the faith community. Churches started reviewing their use of NDAs. Christian media outlets began talking about accountability and transparency in ways they never had before. Quietly, change was happening. Not because of anger or exposure, but because of a woman who finally said, enough. Rebecca didn't want to destroy anything. In her heart, she still loved her family. She missed her mother. She missed the unity they used to have. But she knew that healing couldn't come without honesty. And the truth, as painful as it was, had to come first. There were nights when she cried herself to sleep, overwhelmed by the weight of everything she had unleashed. But there were also moments, precious ones, where she felt peace. Not fake peace, the kind you smile through on camera, but real, deep, soul-level peace, the kind that only comes when you finally stop hiding. Trey's law had given her a key, but it was Rebecca who had to choose whether or not to unlock the door. And when she did, it didn't just change her life. It gave countless others permission to do the same. In the end, it wasn't a courtroom or a headline that gave Rebecca her voice back. It was truth. And truth once spoken doesn't go back in the box. The day Rebecca Lamb spoke her truth, everything changed. At first, it felt like the world paused, just for a moment, then shattered. The image the public had of the Lamb family, so carefully built over decades, cracked right down the middle. What once looked like a shining empire of faith and unity now looked like a family caught in secrets, silence, and struggle. For years, Daystar had been seen as a pillar in Christian broadcasting. People tuned in from all over the world to hear messages of hope, love, and purity. Viewers felt like they knew the Lamb family personally. They had watched marcuslamb preach with passion, Joni Lamb smile through life's storms, and Rebecca grow into a confident voice of her own. But once Rebecca's confession went public, the glow around the family began to fade fast. It didn't happen in one dramatic headline. It happened piece by piece. A post here, a video there, whispers in Christian circles. Social media lit up with questions, judgment, confusion, and heartbreak. Some people rushed to defend Rebecca, calling her brave, honest, and full of grace. Others turned on her immediately, accusing her of betrayal. She was called everything from a whistleblower to a homewrecker. The church world can be brutal when its icons fall. Inside the family, silence became a wall. Joni didn't call. Texts were left unread. Messages from extended family members stopped coming altogether. Even close friends weren't sure what to say. Rebecca had made her choice, and whether they agreed or not, the fallout was real. She wasn't just speaking out about personal issues. She had touched something sacred to many: faith, family, and the illusion of perfection. The ministry at Daystar tried to keep moving. They avoided addressing the issue directly, hoping maybe the storm would pass if they stayed quiet long enough. But silence only fueled more questions. Viewers began tuning out. Donations slowed. People wondered if what they had been watching all these years was genuine or just another performance. Meanwhile, Rebecca was left with a strange mix of emotions: relief, pain, strength, and deep grief. She hadn't spoken to cause destruction. She had spoken to bring healing. But healing, she quickly learned, sometimes starts with fire. And that fire burned through everything. Her relationship with her mother, her position in the ministry, her place in the family. All of it felt like it had been wiped clean. At home, she leaned on JW, her husband, more than ever. He stood by her through every hard day, every cruel comment, every wave of doubt. He reminded her why they had chosen truth over silence. Still, it didn't make the loneliness any easier. There were nights Rebecca cried quietly, missing the warmth of family dinners, the laughter they once shared, the feeling of being in it together. Now it felt like she was on the outside looking in. But in that pain, something new began to grow. For the first time in years, Rebecca could breathe. She didn't have to fake a smile or hide her discomfort. She didn't have to pretend everything was perfect. She was finally free to be real, and in that honesty, she found something powerful: her own voice. Not the voice that echoed what she was told to say on camera, but the voice that had been buried under loyalty, fear, and obligation. She started journaling every morning, pouring her thoughts out onto paper with raw honesty. No filters, no edits, just truth. Some pages were full of sorrow. Others overflowed with gratitude. Slowly, she began to see that this painful chapter wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. Her life didn't have to revolve around a ministry or a legacy built by others. She could build something new. Rebecca began attending a small local church. It wasn't glamorous, no cameras, no stage, just people who didn't treat her like a public figure, people who saw her as a fellow human being, trying to figure things out. In that small, imperfect community, she found healing. She sang worship songs with tears in her eyes. She listened to sermons that felt like they were written just for her. She prayed without pressure, without performance. The road wasn't easy. Some days it felt like she was rebuilding from rubble, but every small step forward felt real. She started speaking privately to other women who had been through similar situations. Some were ministry daughters like her. Others were survivors of toxic systems or spiritual silence. They cried together, prayed together, reminded each other that healing was possible, even after betrayal. Rebecca didn't want revenge. She didn't want attention. She wanted peace. And slowly it began to return to her life, not in one grand moment, but in quiet mornings, soft conversations, and the growing strength in her own heart. She realized she didn't have to carry the weight of saving a legacy. That was never her burden to begin with. Meanwhile, Joni and Doug kept leading Daystar, but the ministry would never be the same. The shine was gone. The questions lingered. Some viewers stayed loyal, others quietly walked away. The Lamb family's empire still stood, but the cracks were visible now. What once looked unshakable had been deeply shaken, and not just by scandal, but by truth. Rebecca knew there would always be people who misunderstood her, who judged her for speaking out, but she had made peace with that. She couldn't control the narrative anymore, and she didn't want to. Her job wasn't to win a public argument. It was to live a life that honored what she knew was right. In the months that followed, she began writing a book, not to attack, but to tell her story honestly. It was slow, emotional work. Every word brought up memories, some painful, some beautiful. But with each page, she felt stronger. This wasn't the story she thought she'd be telling at this stage in her life, but maybe it was the one that needed to be told. Her relationship with her mother remained distant. Occasionally, Joni would send a text. Short, polite. Hope you're well. Rebecca always replied, even when it hurt. A part of her still hoped for healing between them. She didn't know if it would come, but she believed in redemption, even if it looked different than she'd once imagined. In the end, the empire may have cracked, but Rebecca didn't crumble with it. She found a new beginning, one built on honesty, not image, on peace, not performance, on truth, not tradition. And that, she realized, was the most faithful thing she had ever done.